Right. Okay. Okay. I think we're live. I think we've got everything up and running. I've got my screen sharing here, so you should be able to see a number of different tabs I'm going to click through. So, yeah, that's it, really. Hi, folks. I hope things are well with you. And thank you for joining me. I know it's very kind of late and short notice and all of that, but I suppose that's kind of part of the fun of it and part of, you know, just I suppose the way things are. So, this is going to be a very, very brief stream. Um, I want this to be as concise as I can possibly be, right? So I'm gonna try and keep the tangents to a minimum. I'm gonna try and keep this relatively short, 40, 50 minutes. I've got a set of points I just want to talk about, get in, get out, done, right? So how I'm going to structure the stream is as follows, right? First of all, I'm going to do a very, very brief overview of what the presidency is, what the history of it is, why it's important in my opinion, despite the fact that it's to some degree ceremonial. That's the first part. The second part I'm going to go into then is I'm going to talk about all three different candidates and what's good about them, what's bad about them. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just make some predictions. I'm going to talk about how the public and just average Irish people in general think about what's going on right now. And I'm going to talk about in and out about with some of the Maria Steen stuff as well. And I think there we'll kind of finish it off with those points. So yeah, hopefully this is going to be a fairly concise, to the point, no bullshit, fairly tight stream on the whole thing. And yeah, let's get into it. So TJWK Ireland says, good evening. Yeah, good stuff. I'm just reading that out because I assume my sound is coming in fine. But yeah, that's how we're going to structure it. So first of all, let's just talk about the actual just presidency for a second. Where did it come from and why is it here, right? So ultimately speaking, the office of the president was, if you want to read along with me, was established in 1937 as part of replacement for the office of Governor General, basically a representative of the king, basically, or the queen in the Irish government at the time. And basically that existed during 1922 to 1937. So it was established in 1937, and then basically you had a sort of a lull period from like 1937 to 1949, whereby before Ireland was established as a republic, it was really unclear who actually the head of state was. Was it the actual president of Ireland, or was it George the Sixth, right? But ultimately, 1949, Ireland is declared a republic, and ultimately, to kind of get through the main things, there is a point to this, right? So if we take a look at the previous presidents, Douglas Hyde, Sean T. O'Kelly, Eamon de Valera, sorry, Erskine Childers, Carola Dálaigh, Patrick Hillary. Ultimately, these guys were very, very ceremonial, Fianna Fáil. I mean, the joke a bit was that, the presidency up to this point was up to Patrick Hillary was basically a Fianna Fáil kind of retirement package, right? And the idea of, if you kind of read all these kind of media things of oh, so and so Mary Robinson or Mary McAleese or Michael D. Higgins were good presidents. There's kind of a reason you don't really hear that as much prior to Robinson, because since that happened, and once Mary Robinson came in the election in 1990 between her and Brian Lenihan Sr., the position ended up becoming much more symbolic, much more, well, not necessarily symbolic. Symbolic's the wrong word, but stronger in people's heads, right? People will kind of look at the presidency and kind of see, and comment on it and like, oh, this person said this, and, Mary Robinson said this, or Michael D. Higgins said that. And it became a much more kind of like really strong in people's heads position, right? So, yes, it doesn't have that much power. Obviously, it has the power to, sign off on legislation and, can defer to the Supreme Court or whatnot, which is important. But there is a major psychological kind of symbolic significance of this, right? Which has especially come in since Mary Robinson, I would argue. So I would kind of say that, like, in terms of trying to evaluate who a good president would be, I'd say there's almost kind of like three metrics, right? Metric number one is, how do they kind of symbolically represent the Irish people, right? Number two is, are they in their own ways objectively impressive people? Like, have they achieved things in their lives? Are they people that should be kind of like, commended? Are they people who have done good work? All of those kind of things. And number three, are they able to, if given kind of potentially controversial pieces of legislation, are they able to kind of like bring up their opinion and defer that and speak about it in relation to backing up the interests of the Irish people? So when people say, "Oh yeah, it's ceremonial and it's not really that important and they have limited power," I agree, but I disagree at the same time, if that makes sense. So I do think it is worth kind of talking about, and I do think it is worth considering. And based on that, right? I think what I've said is something here that, like, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil and the Irish ruling class and the regime, whatever you want to call them, they agree on this point, right? So because they agree on this point, they have a number of kind of goals and objectives with this. So, the whole kind of acquirement, like, that you need 20 people from the Oireachtas and sorry, or you need four kind of councils majority to get on your side. That's always been there, right? But the question is, like, why is that kind of become an issue now, right? And the reason that's become an issue right now is ultimately, especially since 2018, but COVID, lockdowns, all of that kind of thing, is that the country has definitely hit some, for a segment of the population, um, you know, basically, like, if you're under 40 and you're having housing issues, and maybe you don't have a good job or whatever, if you're in that kind of bucket, like, the last few years have been genuinely more difficult for you, right? And so that's the first thing. But also the other thing with the presidency, again, if you go back to Mary Robinson here, right? If you take a look at voting patterns, I mean, I would argue that, if you compare Irish people to, like, in terms of voting patterns, to like Latin America or Italy or something like that, right? Irish people are very kind of, conservative, stable, we want a sensible choice. We want things to be predictable. We want things to be reliable, right? That's not as true with the presidency elections, right? So, for example, like, in the 1990 election with Robinson and Lenihan, Brian Lenihan was actually scheduled to win it up until basically the last few days. In 2011, Sean Gallagher was just about to win the whole thing, and then you had that frontline program with Pat Kenny presenting it, which basically set the guy up. And that pushed Michael D. Higgins to become president for 2 terms, right? And then in 2018, Peter Casey, who was on 1%, basically makes a couple of comments about immigration and travelers, and his popularity goes from about 1% to about like 18 or 19%. So my point being is that, like, in terms of Irish presidency elections, Irish people are typically much more likely to go, I'm going to just go for the random guy, I'm going to go for the person who is kind of set up as an outsider, right? Much more so than, say, like general elections or anything like that, right? Or like local elections to a lesser degree. But anyway, that still applies. So if I know this, I think a lot of people within, say, like, the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael know this, right? So they're taking a look at this, and they know that things have been deteriorating for a percentage of the population over the past while. And they know that, like, if they were to get in, say, like, on the extreme end, or the extreme for them, Conor McGregor, right? Conor McGregor would be such a symbolic change. You go from basically a leftist academic sociology lecturer like Michael D. Higgins to Conor McGregor talking about mass immigration, right? That would be such a huge change. But also it would throw up all sorts of issues of, like, humiliating you in terms of, like, oh, we're trying to pass this bit of legislation, and then McGregor or whoever, or a candidate we don't necessarily like, might start talking out against this, right? So that becomes an issue for them. And when they kind of look at it in this way, you know, that's how they're kind of viewing it. Like, especially with like, the increased amount of, I mean, I had a tweet up here and it's maybe a bit cheesier, pretentiously written, but I don't know. But yeah, whatever. So it kind of describes this. Like, I think one major outcome of this election is that more people are starting to realize we don't really live in a democracy. We live in an authoritarian, crippled, and tired gerontocracy that is bored with itself, masquerading as a progressive, enlightened, caring society. And that's the thing, because I think with a lot of kind of like, Irish politicians, they want to portray Ireland as like, oh, high GDP, richest country in the world. We're progressive, we're enlightened and caring, right? But then, whether it's the hate speech laws or whether it's Conor McGregor ending up in like, the White House and all that kind of stuff, whenever there's stuff to like burst that bubble, you know, they really don't like that at all. And one of the things that's especially come out of today, especially with Maria Steen, is that that bubble for a lot of people has been burst, right? You know, so basically, like, they set up this. Simon Harris comes in and talks about like, banning Fine Gael councillors from voting for people in terms of like, getting people on the ticket. And then you've got like there was a thing yesterday that came out about Willie O'D. You can say what you want about Willie O'D, and can you take what he was saying seriously at the time? But then there was a couple of things that leaked out that basically Martin kind of phoned O'D and said, "No, you're not doing that," or you know, if anyone kind of goes against the party line on this, you're going to lose the party whip. It was that kind of serious, right? So that's that in addition to the increasing kind of like this authoritarian stuff, right? And when I mean authoritarian, what I'm trying to reference here or trying to refer to essentially like basically, you know, one of the things that Ireland I think is converging in on is, and I don't mean they're literally going to be this, right? But certainly converging in on in some way in terms of the political system. And this is why I'm going to argue the whole point about spoiling your vote or not voting is not the best idea is basically this, right? So you have like, you take something like I don't know, like Russia or something like that, right? You have a much more kind of authoritarian country there, right? And the idea would be something along the lines of you want people demoralized, you want people depoliticized, you don't want people to engage in the system, and then you just do what you want. And that's ultimately what it's converging in on. Because the other thing with the presidency is that you don't, and again, when I was talking about the outsider factor here, you don't want people to kind of really get into that because otherwise you could have potentially very, very interesting and strange people much more likely to be elected. I mean, like I said, Irish voting patterns. Irish people are very, very stable, reliable, good people, consistent in terms of voting, right? But not as much with the presidential stuff. And we've got about 3 or 4 different presidential election examples of this. And that's something they're really worried about. But anyway, to go back to the authoritarian stuff, right? Their ultimate goals, I think, from their point of view for this presidential election is this, right? Maintain low voter turnout, get Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil card-carrying members, boomers basically, to vote your people in, no controversy, no nonsense. But of course, what's happened is that they've started tripping up with themselves in terms of like, the whole, well, why aren't you allowing Garrett Sheraton on? Well, why aren't you allowing Maria Steen on? All of this kind of stuff, right? And that's been a mistake from their end, basically. Joe Blog says it is a simulation of freedom, but Lisbon Treaty proved our democracy is fake. Nobody talks about the elephant in the room. Yeah, I mean, there's the whole kind of European Union kind of thing to all of this, right? But ultimately, that leads into my first point. So basically, with the kind of authoritarian stuff I've talked about there, and Ireland is kind of converging in on that system. There's no question about it. I mean, do I need to provide more examples, right? But despite all that, right? Despite all the kind of control and trying to keep candidates and keeping people out, and why that started to bother people for the first time, because ultimately, like there have been councillors and there have been people who have wanted to, even Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael people, who have wanted to give out votes to, independent councillors and independent candidates, but they haven't been allowed to. So, with all of that, what I've said, let's go through the 5 outcomes, right? What is the best out of a 5 bad choices, but what's the best one, So we'll go through them. So the first one is basically, like I said, you don't turn up, you don't bother voting, you don't cast your ballot, however you want to phrase it, right? You don't do that. That's exactly what they want, right? That's exactly what they want. So, and it doesn't really do anything. And even if you're doing that, in a sense, you actually are voting for someone. So, if you've got candidate A and candidate B, candidate A is 100,000 votes ahead of candidate B, but there's 100,000 people who would have voted for B, who didn't vote, or 100,001, okay, whatever. Then you've essentially, in a sort of a roundabout way, you've voted for candidate A, even though you haven't turned up, right? So that's the first option. The option is simply not turning up. That's a lousy option, in my opinion. So that's option number one. Option number two, which has been floating around a bit, is this idea of spoiling your vote, right? So you turn up and you just scribble like, I want to vote Marie Steen or whatever. You spoil your vote and then you leave, right? So there are a number of ways or things or ways for that to work, or things in terms of like what you want out of it. So why are you trying to spoil your vote? You're trying to spoil your vote because you want to send a message that the whole thing is nonsense and ludicrous and a tied up show, right? Okay, fine. Back to my first point though, on like, they just want to get their own people in and keep people depoliticized, right? In a sense, they don't care if you spoil your vote. Okay? They don't really care. And also, if you wanted to kind of like add on to that, like, in order for it to be an issue. So remember my tweet here, like, masquerading as a progressive, enlightened, caring society. Okay, so if you were to get an example whereby, a huge quantity of votes would be spoiled, right? Then the thing is, with that spoiled vote, or that set of spoiled votes, is basically that once those spoiled votes come through the system, someone needs to kind of note them and comment on them and talk about them. So if there's a huge amount of spoiled votes in the system, honest question, do you think RTE, or do you think the Irish Times, or do you think Gavin O'Reilly, or do you think Virgin Media are going to talk about this stuff? They're probably not, right? They're probably not going to talk about it because, again, it violates this tweet, right? How do you have a progressive, enlightened, caring society and whatnot when, people are angry and are spoiling their votes left, right, and center? So that's the first thing with the spoiling the votes argument. The second thing with the spoiling the votes argument, in order for that to work, you would probably need a case whereby you would have so many spoiled votes that, like, a newspaper from the United Kingdom or Elon Musk tweets it out or whatever, for it to pick up any sort of momentum. And even if all of that stuff comes true, you're ultimately left with the same thing that I've said before, that, like, you're still in a roundabout way voting for someone if you spoil your vote, right? So, and even if you got that reaction, and there's a good chance you wouldn't actually, because people do actually want to vote for people. Most people are not kind of as wired to kind of, I would say, vote for, do the whole spoiled ballot thing. Even if you were to get all that through, you might have a couple of like articles kind of going, oh, look at the far right, with their spoiled ballots, or, you'll get something like that, but that will last a few days and that will blow over. And then you're ultimately still left with the fact that you've got a president for 7 more years. And the way I think that people are kind of thinking, and especially the way like Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are essentially the same party now due to voting patterns and voting transfers, you're basically almost kind of saying, oh, well, Heather Humphreys or Jim Gavin, kind of without almost saying it, right? So I've seen a couple of people tweet this out, and I don't necessarily agree with it, because I don't really see it go anywhere. And, if it's a small enough number, they're just not going to care. And if it's a big enough number, you might get like a funny, or, someone commenting on it from abroad or whatever, Elon Musk tweet or whatever, and then it's just forgotten about. And like maybe another argument might be like, we need more people to know about this stuff. But like the whole country knows now, thanks to Maria Steen, right? Or Conor McGregor, or any of this, like any of these people. You know, there is an article, I don't have it up here, but apparently like a UCD professor talked about how the whole thing is nonsense and how she is thinking of like challenging it as well. Like, so people know, right? People know that the whole thing is a closed shop. So, you know, I don't really buy the spoiled ballot stuff. Maybe if it kind of builds up over the next while, sure. But as of now, I don't really buy it. So that's option number 2, right? Option number 3 is Heather Humphreys. Vote for Heather Humphreys. Now, I would say kind of 2 things about this, right? Maybe 3 things. The first one is that there's the whole kind of like, I don't know, like Orange Order stuff with her. And, you know, in my opinion, like there's something wrong about having the president of Ireland and then having, I mean, forget even the Protestant, I don't, whatever about that. But like, you know, Orange Order affiliated president of Ireland who is a senior, or who was an ex-senior minister of Fine Gael since, and part of that Fine Gael cohort since 2011. And that just strikes me as really demoralizing, right? There's just something grim about that. It's like, oh yeah, you've got like a, you know, I mean, there's Neil Richmond who's gone to Orange Order parades, and then you've got Leo Varadkar talking about like getting commemorating the Black and Tans in 2020, all this kind of stuff, right? But like, I don't know, there's just something, and like she would just kind of like toe the party line and just do what's said and all that kind of stuff. I think it would be kind of a grim choice that if people and boomers just went for like the party or the organization that basically have contributed to Ireland getting considerably worse in a considerable number of metrics since 2011. So I think she's a grim choice, and I think she would be quite highly ranked in terms of actually getting it, right? And I'll talk about why in a bit. So that's your third option, right? Now, your fourth option is Jim Gavin, right? So Jim Gavin basically. So again, just to back up the Heather thing. So, are they impressive people? Are they symbolic? Would they actually challenge the government on contentious legislation? And to all those questions, I would answer, yeah, maybe not really, right? And when I say impressive, I'm not trying to be a snob. I'm not an impressive person myself by any means, but you would think that, like, on paper, right, these kind of government positions, these kind of like, the president of Ireland, on paper, these people should be like the best of the best, astonishing, like extremely high IQ, extremely well read, just really talented people to look up to, right? Yeah, I'm not even talking like if you're smart or very talented. I mean, like, I'm talking like the best of the best, right? So those 3 criteria are not necessarily kind of like fulfilled in my opinion. So let's go on to Jim Gavin, right? Now, Jim Gavin has the same kind of issues with her, part of Fianna Fáil, all of that, the kind of symbolic nature of like, being part of a party which has wreaked a lot of damage on the country over the past, like, 2 decades and all of that kind of thing. But the only thing with him, I would say, is, and again, just think about, like, say, the past 3 presidents, right? The past 3 presidents have had like essentially 3 leftist activists, right? And Gavin is more, I mean, he's a sports guy. He's done some impressive stuff in the army. He's got an impressive like GA kind of background and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, I know he's kind of like, by the way, he's not my choice, and I'll get to a bit why Connolly, in my opinion, is the best choice. But ultimately, like, would you prefer, from a symbolic point of view, would you prefer a kind of a leftist academic type, or would you prefer a kind of, yeah, I know he's a bit of a Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael gone bean and all that, but he is on paper somewhat normal and somewhat impressive. And it would be a little bit of a shift away from that kind of stuff. So, I again, I need to clarify and I need to reiterate on this. Like, this is very low bar stuff, right? I think everyone here, and certainly myself, wanted Maria Steen and all that kind of stuff, right? But I'm just kind of trying to argue through, like, what's the best outcome in terms of all of this, to the best that can be done, or to the best of our ability, and all that kind of stuff. So ultimately, yeah, he would be a better choice than Humphreys, I would say, for those reasons. Rather than kind of basically a GAA grey man who does what he's told, but is somewhat impressive in certain ways. I think that's a better choice than a Orange Order affiliated Fine Gael minister, basically, right? So that is, so we're past choice number 4, right? And so, and by the way, I want to kind of go into this kind of briefly. I just want to talk about how almost nefarious what they've done with this stuff, right? So here's a quick one, right? So Emma D'Souza, there's no gotcha in Heather's Orange Order connections. The challenge for Heather Humphreys is not her family's history, but how she handled the question of her husband's prior membership of the Orange Order. And here's another one. Heather Humphreys recalls attending Orange parades as she gives back into Irish unity. So the reason I just want to bring that up is basically the way they're kind of trying to market this is basically, well, she would be great for unity. She would be great for, we're all one people, a president for all people. If you're against this, you're a racist. That's how they're trying to market this, right? And I think to some degree that this might actually maybe work with boomers, right? But again, like it's astonishing in a way, because if you go back to January of 2020, right? Varadkar was talking about, like, Varadkar basically did a lot of damage to the Fine Gael vote because he was talking about commemorating the Black and Towns. I've talked about this already. I've mentioned this in the stream already. But it seems that, like, this stuff, it should be a bigger deal, but it's kind of not, and I'll get into that. But ultimately, that's how they're going to try and swing it with normal people. I think personally, out of all 3 candidates, the kind of, like, whatever you want to call it, the regime, right? They want her in the most. And I'll talk about, and like, even the stuff I've been watching, like, on terms of, like, articles, people talking about them, journalists, interviews, even interviews I've watched with Jim Gavin, right? They definitely want Humphreys in more because of all that kind of, oh, we're Fine Gael are all about unity. And then also the kind of, like, well, another woman president, and that would be great because for the sake of it, right? You know what I mean? So they would prefer her to Gavin, and they would definitely prefer her to Connolly, right? So the last choice, or the last person out of those choices, is Catherine Connolly, right? Now, okay, so I just want to just say out front, again, just repeating myself, all bad choices. Take the least worst choice. That's kind of my kind of opinion here. And yes, I know I'm gonna kind of contradict myself a bit when I start talking about, like, the leftist activists and all that kind of stuff, right? But there's a few interesting things about her, and yeah, I know, like, she's being supported by People Before Profit and Social Democrats and all this kind of stuff, right? But the thing is, right, if you kind of look into her, she's actually done some pretty cool stuff. Well, yeah, pretty cool actually. No, I won't miss my words there. So here's one, right? Hate speech laws. If we want to take a look at the politicians who voted against the hate speech laws, right? There you go. Catherine Connolly. She voted against them, right? Oh, I clicked the wrong thing there, but you know what I mean. She voted against the hate speech laws. Now, I watched the clip of her talking about that, and she basically said that the hate speech laws were welcome, but they went too far, right? So, but, like, unlike Fianna Fáil, unlike Fine Gael, she voted against the hate speech laws, and for me anyway, the hate speech laws were extremely important. Now, here's another one. Connolly. government is demonizing the unvaccinated. Catherine Connolly, TD, has hit out at the government for their approach to COVID restrictions, accusing them of unfairly demonizing unvaccinated people. The remarks were made by independent Galway West TD during a Dáil debate on how the country will recover from the impact of COVID-19. It is extremely difficult to raise the questions in this country about civil rights or alternative views in dealing with the pandemic, right? We believe vaccination and all medical treatment should be a choice, right? And I'm not going to go into it as much because, again, I want to keep this stream relatively concise. But in terms like the vaccine passports and all that kind of stuff, right? She did actually like talk against this and vote against this, right? And you know, there's more of this stuff. I mean, for example, like here is another one, right? Remember the 2 referendums last year, right? She said TD will take her chances with current woman in the home wording rather than wishy-washy replacement. Again, you know, she basically just supported a no vote, right? And then there's other things as well. I mean, she's talked about like, you know, she's called out some of the, you know, European Union kind of overreach, all that kind of thing. And yeah, here's another one as well, which I thought was interesting. And I think this is actually a pretty interesting, or, well, is it a good kind of source of character? Hold on. Oh God, I must have copied and pasted it over. But basically, the thing I was going to talk about was there was a. Do you remember? Jesus Christ, do you remember like about a week and a bit ago, right? Owen Hayes, right, had a kind of a scandal or a mini scandal because about 15 or 16 years ago, he wore brown makeup on his hands and face and dressed up as a Barack Obama, right? And it's the most stupid non-scandal ever, right? And a lot of these kind of like, you know, reading through the comments and reading through some of the Social Democrat stuff on this, you know, it's very kind of funny or very kind of interesting because ultimately, like, you know, it was full of all this stuff like, you know, racism can never be accepted, you know, and all this kind of stuff, right? And there's a few articles actually that came out recent where Catherine Connolly just basically said, no, this is nonsense. You know, he just dressed up as Barack Obama. That's it. No one cares, right? And it's just funny, like, and again, it kind of goes back a bit to the authoritarian stuff. You're not allowed to laugh or joke about things. I mean, do you know almost why he did that blackface? I can bet you $1 to donut why, right? He did that in 2009, right? What film that loads of people like came out a few months before that? This one. Did you ever see this one? I mean, come on, like a lot of people have seen this film, right? A lot of people have seen this film. Tropic Thunder, right? The whole film, like, you know, fucking Robert Downey Jr. in blackface, right? And people loved this film because people thought it was funny, right? And it came out around that time. That's why he did it, right? That's more than likely why he did it, because it was in a film that people liked that came out during the time, right? So ultimately, like, you know, and we can see all this, like, we can see this kind of this one here, right? This one was kind of funny, the Catherine Connolly launch, right? And it's just this kind of like tired looking, bored looking, you know, group of leftists and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I know it's kind of low energy and whatnot and all of that kind of thing. But you know, that's the thing as well. Like you know, I think a lot of this stuff, like a lot of the so-called woke stuff or whatever, is to some degree, you know, on the decline a little bit, right? So, you know, and I think the thing is with her as well. There's another thing she talked about, like this. She had this statement about Hamas, right? And you know, then a lot of like other people in this picture kind of saying, "Oh no, we disagree with what she said," and all that kind of thing, right? So ultimately, what I'm trying to say here is that just think back, right? Think back if we were back in 2021 and she was your theoretical president, and she said something along the lines of like, you know, the vaccine passport is nonsense. Or think about if she was potentially president in 2023 and she came out and said the hate speech laws are nonsense. Do you see what I mean? Kind of with the symbolic stuff, right? Again, you can just look this stuff all, up all by yourself, and you know, basically, like, with a lot of these people, like I probably, with anyone here in this picture, or with a lot of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael people, you know, I'd probably agree with them on maybe 5 to 10% of things. With her, maybe that might be about 40% of things. You know what I mean? So if you had her, like, potentially, like, you would have a situation whereby, like, if something mad or weird was to come up that we would agree with, she might actually talk up against it, and the other two wouldn't. The other two wouldn't make a statement. The other two would just say what the government want. Her, not so much. I think she could actually back up actual Irish people. And if she's in that position where she's making these kind of comments, and then she's got a kind of a, you know, so, like, she might make a comment, and a lot of people here might kind of go like, oh, she's crazy or whatever, right? She might actually just find out, holy shit, these people are not as kind of my friends as much, if that kind of makes sense. So yeah, I mean, like, just reading some comments there. Matthew Barry says it doesn't matter if there's a decline in wokeness, because the people whom it's declining in popularity with are emigrating or have immigrated already. Yep. And ultimately, it's kind of more turning into, like, if you disagree with us, well, yeah, we're gonna punish you for that. Yeah, the young. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I get you there. So, like, yeah. So ultimately, out of those five options, right? Out of those five options, I would say that she's the best choice, right? Um, she will actually be willing to speak out on certain topics. She's proven it before. Um, and you know, okay, she's another kind of more left wing activist type, but she would actually be willing to speak out on certain things, like I said, and she would maybe be able to back up certain Irish people, like people who didn't take the vaccine. And yeah, that's almost kind of it, really. So yeah, so I just want to kind of finish off on kind of a couple of other points. Like I said, this is going to be a very, very brief stream. This is going to be a very, very brief stream. And by the way, like, obviously, like, if you're, if you want to spoil your vote, look, I don't fucking blame you. Honestly, I'm just talking about, like I've mentioned earlier in the stream. I don't think that's necessarily the best choice. I think if you're going to vote, the best choice is her number one, Gavin number two. Um, and yeah, like, the idea of that, the kind of orange order stuff is just a bit, yeah, it's not great, really. It's not great. So yeah, I'll just kind of finish off the stream here in terms of, like, where things might go from here. So basically, like, I think ultimately, like, the Irish mainstream, or the main parties on average, want her to win, Heather Humphreys. So I think what's going to happen is that I don't know if she's that reliable on these issues, since he hasn't really done anything other than kind words. That said, I don't. Yeah, I know. Look, that's what Minion Mime said. Like, yeah, you're right. You're right. You're absolutely right. But like, what are the alternatives? That's kind of the thing. Like, Maria Steen would have been great, but she's not there. So um, yeah. So basically, where is this kind of going forward? So basically, I just from a kind of an average Irish person's point of view thing, your man Jim Gavin, um, he doesn't seem to be very kind of like as charismatic or as good with talking with people. I think people were kind of peeved off with the fact that, like, that whole kind of, there was a weird ad, right? And there was a weird kind of, like, campaign ad whereby, like, he's dressed up as a farmer and all the kind of stuff about him wearing white pants, not closing the gate, and all that kind of stuff. Stupid things like that. And then, the comments about, I don't know if they've stuck or not, but they're still floating around. Those comments made about, his personal life and all that kind of thing. As for Catherine Connolly, like, Catherine Connolly is, Matthew Barry says she doesn't seem like a strong character that could assert herself. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing too. Like, she's not. I don't think she's a particularly skilled speaker. And there have been kind of interviews and clips with her whereby, like, journalists, Fine Gael affiliated journalists and whatnot have like been able to kind of run rings around her. And there are a couple of comments that they've been trying to hit her with, like, Gemma O'Doherty, supporting Gemma O'Doherty and all that kind of thing. And she hasn't been able to answer them particularly well. The other thing as well is, just to go back to that point, like when I was kind of talking about, like, with a lot of presidential elections, you have like your sort of establishment candidate and your outsider candidate, you know, or outsider competitor, like, a Peter Casey or whatnot. She's the closest to that. And, you know, the thing is, like, with the whole kind of woke stuff declining off a bit, I mean, we even know this in the data from like voting patterns of the past Irish election. Like, Irish people would look at her and they would see the kind of media stuff. They would see that maybe she's not the best speaker. And they would also see this kind of like the fact that she's more of a leftist, and they would kind of go, "Oh, well, I don't want to vote for that," right? And I would have originally said, like, even a couple of weeks ago, that like Jim Gavin, um, people would have been like, "Oh, he's normal. I'm going to go vote for him." But he's made a bunch of like kind of weird mistakes and said a bunch of weird things. Um, Plus, I think, like I said, the kind of Irish, you know, journalist sphere, for lack of a better phrase, they Connolly is like low energy Jeb, yeah, yeah. But that's what Mark Walden said there. But between all of that, um, they're going to try. Like, I mean, even when Jim Gavin's candidacy was announced, like, you had journalists kind of like heckling him, like, why haven't you spoken out on these issues before? Why didn't you? We're going to ask you about every referendum that you voted on, like the gay marriage one and whatnot, and we want your exact opinion, and we want you to conform with us. So they've treated they definitely seem to have treated those two a lot harsher than Humphreys, because they want to, right? So ultimately speaking, that, and between the kind of low energy stuff and whatnot, and also another thing as well, which I thought was interesting. Uh, I thought I was walking through my local village earlier today, and I saw they actually put up Heather Humphreys and Jim Gavin posters. And one of the things that was really interesting was that the logos on those two posters were really, really small. Like, you can barely, like, if you were walking from a distance, you wouldn't know that they were like Fine Gael or Fianna Fáil. So they're really just trying to detach this. They're trying to keep this as boring as possible, low turnout as possible, and get someone in who just agrees with us, says our talking points, and nods away, and just signs off on whatever we would say. And like I said, the idea of Irish people voting for anything to do with the Orange Order is horrible. And again, maybe just back to the Catherine Connolly point, at least there's a little bit, not much, but there's a little bit of kind of, she will kind of say outsider things a little bit, right? And things that might genuinely benefit people, Irish people, which is a good thing. But ultimately, what my kind of prediction is, or what I can see happening, is over the coming weeks, but especially in the last week with these kind of debates, they're going to try and, especially like what happened in 2011 with Sean Gallagher, they're going to try and set them, or her, up as well in particular. But they're going to try and set the other two up with kind of gotcha questions and, gotcha moments and whatnot. And I don't think the other two are as skilled with dealing with something like that as maybe Humphreys would. And simply put, I think they're going to leave Humphreys alone a lot more, because one of the kind of, that, and they're not even going to ask her, this kind of stuff like that's leaked out about, like, animal cruelty allegations and all this kind of thing. But yeah, I think ultimately the way it's going, and also the other thing to take into consideration is transfers, right? So basically, if you had a situation whereby Connolly was the top, and then like Humphreys was second and Gavin was third, Gavin would transfer a huge amount into Humphreys, or if the other thing happened, vice versa, right? So ultimately, like, the chances of her winning are definitely on the kind of like outside point of view when you kind of stack everything up, and then normal Irish people kind of look at her and look at this and go, geez, I'm not voting for some person who thinks there's like 10 genders and whatnot. I'm just going to go with Mad for It Too says, I think Gavin will win because the hatred for Fine Gael is just too much, which Humphreys represents. Yeah, that could be. I mean, that's a thing too, and that's why they didn't put the logo on the that's one of the reasons why they're not putting Fine Gael logos on Fine Gael posters, right? But I think what they'll just try and do is they'll try and just throw enough stuff at Gavin, and I just don't think he's a good enough speaker to kind of handle this kind of stuff. And Humphreys will just look more like the normal one by default, if that kind of makes sense. So if you do want a candidate who might actually talk about one or two things, imagine if we got, I mean, let me put it this way. If we got like, if they started pushing hate speech laws again, would you rather have Catherine Connolly maybe there saying something about it? And she has said this stuff about it in the past, and she's actively voted against it in the past. Or would you want like just Jim Gavin just nodding along and agreeing, or Heather Humphreys nodding along and agreeing? I know like the person you're voting for and whatnot. But it basically is what it is. So I think that's ultimately the kind of projection there. And again, like I said, that's the other thing she has against her too, because those two are going to link up with each other. Like, they're going to, you're going to get boomer votes that are going to transfer from Humphreys to Gavin if that's the order, or Gavin to Humphreys if that's the order, right? That's assuming Connolly doesn't appear at the bottom, but that's very likely as well. So yeah, I mean that's ultimately it. I mean, ultimately, I'm just a guy talking on the internet. Do what you want to do, but just kind of looking at it in that way, I think Connolly is the best choice. I know yes, I know she's a massive leftist and whatnot, but all I'm saying is that, like, just hate speech laws, vaccine passport, she was against that stuff, so that's pretty good. So yeah, we're coming up to 50 minutes. We've got 20 people here. Good stuff. So I'm just reading through a couple of extra comments there. Yeah, a bunch from Joe Blogs. With the AFD in the March, UK falling apart. The Irish think it's 2010 Obama era with their heads in the sand and fingers in their ears. Yep. I'd sooner give Michael D the role back. He's bad, but all of those three are horrendous. Yeah, I mean, Michael D Higgins, I would actually like to do a stream on him, because there's a lot of like interesting and weird stuff about him, like that's not really talked about. Yeah, I mean, like I mean, for example, I'll give an example, like, I'm just rambling a little bit now, but like if you type in Michael D Higgins Foucault, Michel Foucault, the postmodernist, the Jordan Peterson thing, right? There's a speech where he talks about how when he was a sociology lecturer in Galway, he was trying to bring in all these kind of postmodernist thinkers that, the kind of weird stuff like the queer literature and whatnot. And he got a lot of flack for it at the time, and he said he was proud that he was kind of bringing all this stuff in. If you type in, Michael D. Higgins Foucault, you'll find a bit of the stuff. But like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, at least he kind of like, God, I don't know. Like he was doing stuff like celebrating communist dictators and all this kind of stuff. Just kind of mad stuff, Ted. Like, So, to this day, only our rivers run free. Yeah. The creation of TG Carter was his main achievement. Yeah. No, that's a fair point. That's a good one as well. And apparently, actually, I don't know if anyone has been kind of following who watches kind of the live stream. I've talked about Desmond Fennell a lot. Apparently, like Michael D. Higgins and Desmond Fennell were actually quite buddies with each other for a bit. They did respect each other. Like he is a smart man in certain ways, but like, yeah, he's, but that's the thing though, isn't that kind of a very interesting thing that like two men like that could be friends, like in the 80s or 90s, like despite massive different political opinions and beliefs. And then today it's kind of like if you had those two people with like those contrasting views, it's like, one of them will try and get the other like just, racist, fascist, and you don't deserve to work in a job, that kind of stuff. That's been a real thing that's really kind of come to effect. But yeah, like I said, that's where we're at right now, I suppose. So yeah, ultimately, yeah, we're up to 50 minutes. Um, in conclusion, yeah, so in conclusion, I did a very, very kind of brief history, extremely micro brief history of what the presidency actually is. I talked about maybe why we should kind of care about it or have an interest in it. I talked about the five different outcomes, or not even the five different outcomes. There's only three different outcomes, but the five different decisions we can make. You know, don't vote, spoil the vote. Gavin, Humphreys, Connolly. I talked about, or I tried to argue which I think is the best one out of all of those. And then I just made a couple of predictions in terms of like where this might end. But ultimately, I think the Irish regime, for lack of a better phrase, wants Heather Humphreys in. And I think like a couple of the articles I've shown, I think they're going to be way nicer to her than the other two candidates. And as things are going right now, Humphreys will probably win it. Although, like I said before, presidential elections are extremely volatile. Michael D. Higgins was losing literally up until the last day or two. Mary Robinson was pretty much losing up until the last day or two. Peter Casey went from nothing to like 21% in the last week or so. So making predictions with this kind of stuff is very hard, especially until the last week. But that's the kind of trend right now. And like I said, without a lack of like best options, I think Connolly, for the reasons I've listed, is probably the best one, because there might be an issue, like just based on past performance, that she might actually agree with a lot of us on, and she might actually speak about it. And in certain cases, like the hate speech laws, she'll vote against it. So yeah, that's pretty much it from me. 52 minutes. I think we'll leave it there. Thank you for joining me on a Wednesday evening, Wednesday night, and yeah, we'll leave it there. And yeah, I'm just taking a look for a couple more comments. Okay, there's a load from Joe Blogs, but yeah, I wanted to keep this stream as concise as possible. So yeah, appreciate the comments. Have a good one, folks, and I'll see you next time. See you now. Bye.